The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that in regards to the amount of time that it took Noach to build a teva, the Medrash tells us that it took him 120 years. Rashi brings us in his Pirush on Torah as well. Says the Rebbe, we need to understand what is taking Noach so long to build a teva, and why isn't he fulfilling the tzivui of Hashem of making this teva of goifer wood? Why isn't he doing it bezrizus? Especially that his own being saved and the whole world is all dependent on this. Rashi is not answering this, not even beremes. Says the Rebbe, we cannot say that in this detail Noach was acting inappropriately because the pasuk itself says, Ish tzaddik tamim hoyo, he's a complete tzaddik. Even according to the opinion that says that this is only relative to his own generation, but in regards to the building of the teva itself, the pasuk says, Vayas Noach did exactly as Hashem had told him. He did everything, so it's understood that in regards to this command, he did everything perfectly with all of its details. Says the Rebbe, we also cannot say that since Hashem had already said that he's anyways going to stretch out this punishment, in other words, it's only going to start after 120 years, perhaps the generation of the Mabul will do tshuva. So this is why Noach is not in a rush to build a teva, because in the meantime he could arouse the people of his generation to do tshuva. Especially that if they do tshuva, there will be no Mabul and no need for a teva. Says the Rebbe, we cannot say this because of two reasons. Number one, by the actual command of making the teva does not say by when the teva needs to be ready. In other words, once again, Noach should be trying to do this as soon as possible. And since, as we said, Noach did everything b'shleimus, it does not make sense to say that he was delaying fulfilling the command, even for the purpose of getting the people to do tshuva. And number two, says the Rebbe, this would only explain why Noach would delay building the teva to a closer time, closer to the end of the 120 years. And in the meantime, he could be involved in trying to arouse the people to do tshuva. It still does not understand why he needs to be involved in building the teva the whole duration of the 120 years. Says the Rebbe, the explanation we could say simply is, seemingly as Rashi himself says, as the Medrash tells us, that the reason why Hashem told Noach to build a teva, even though there's many ways of how Hashem could save Noach, and why is he burdening him with building this teva? The reason is so that the people of the Mabul should see him being involved in for 120 years. They're asking him, why are you doing this? He tells them Hashem is going to bring a Mabul, perhaps they will do tshuva. In other words, the building of the teva itself and the idea of getting the people to do tshuva are not two distinct and separate things. Rather, they're one and the same. The point of building the teva was a means to getting them to do tshuva. And since this is the reason of why he needs to build a teva, it's understood that the fact that Noach is taking his time with building the teva is not the opposite of zerizus in fulfilling the command. Rather, this is the real way of how he's fulfilling the command, because the purpose of building the teva is in order for them to see what he's doing. Perhaps they will do tshuva. However, the Rebbe says this still is not smooth enough. This isn't perfectly answering the question. Why? Because in order to arouse the people to do tshuva, and they will ask, what are you doing? What's this all about? Again, seemingly he does not have to take so long with building the teva. Even if the teva would have been already completed beforehand, they could have still asked, what's this teva all about? And he will tell them what it's for. So we're back to square one. Why does Noach have to drag out fulfilling the mitzvah of making this teva over a 120-year period, which is again seemingly completely the opposite of zerizus? While what he could have done was immediately fulfill the mitzvah of Hashem, build the teva with the greatest zerizus, and then the completed teva could arouse by the people the question, what is this all about? Says the Rebbe, we must say that the idea of aseilucha tevas atzegoifer, etc., the idea of what the Eibishter tells him to build a teva, somehow this itself is really forcing us to say that it's going to take a long time to make it, 120 years. And the Rebbe says this could also be seen from the expression that Rashi brings, why is he burdening him with this building so that the people of the Mabul should be able to see him involved in it 120 years, and they're going to ask him what's going on. In other words, it comes out that the Eibishter L'chatchila is burdening him with this building that has to take 120 years so that the people should see and ask and be nis'oder to tshuva, and not that he's dragging it out for this purpose so that they should see. In other words, it's from the words itself, asei lecha, that it's forcing him to take a long time. Why is that? Says the Rebbe very, very simply. The words asei lecha, the translation of Pshuta Shel Mikra means you should make it. As the Abarbanel actually says, Asay Lucha means that Noach himself has to make the teva and not command somebody else to do it. The tzivui was Noach himself should build a teva. Furthermore, the Ragachover actually explains, according to halacha, that whenever you have the word asay or an expression, something similar to asay of doing, the mitzvah is the act itself. In other words, not only the result, but there's the action itself. That's the point of the mitzvah. So too by an aveira, that if there's regarding a certain prohibition, there's an expression of asiyah, then the way you're going to be over is by actually doing an act, not only if you caused something to be. That's not where that's not where the chiyuv is going to be. It's, in other words, the action itself, both in the positive and the negative, both in a mitzvah and an aveira. It's if you did the action itself. Says the Rebbe, so too over here with making the teva. Since it says asay lecha regarding making the teva, that the mitzvah is the action itself, therefore Noach himself has to do the whole work of building the teva. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, al derech halacha, this couldn't have even been done through a shliach, because even if you say that in the mitzvahs where there's an expression of asay, of doing something, you could do it through a shliach, and when the shliach does it, it's exactly as if the mishaleach would have done it. However, Noach wouldn't have been able to make a shliach for building the teva, since a ben Noach does not have the geder of shlichus in the way of shluchis shaladim kamoisoi. And therefore Noach himself has to make it. Therefore, says the Rebbe, based on all of this, it's not a chidush that even though it's not, in other words, it's not a question even though, of course, Noach was going to be fulfilling the mitzvah of Hashem in the most perfect way with the greatest zrizus, and yet it takes him 120 years if he has to build it all by himself. Says the Rebbe, on the contrary, if he's doing it all by himself, it's even a surprise and a wonder how he managed to do it in no more than 120 years. The Rebbe continues and says, by the Ragachover, we actually find in this particular case, regarding the teva, two svaros. Whether the making of the teva is a mitzvah, whether the mitzvah is the act of building, or the mitzvah was the result, having the teva, not the act of building. In other words, we should have a completed teva. Says the Rebbe, we could say that this is dependent on the way we view what's the purpose, what's the mitzvah of making the teva. If the purpose of the teva was only to save Noach from the Mabul, then there isn't anything inherently important in the act of building itself. In other words, the whole point is just the end result, the teva itself. If, however, we should say that being involved in building of the teva is so that people should see what he's doing and ask him what he's doing, and then this is going to cause him to do tshuva, perhaps this will cause him to do tshuva, then the building itself is a mitzvah because this is going to bring them to do tshuva. Says the Rebbe, according to this we can explain what Rashi means when he says that there's many ways how Hashem could save Noach. Why is he burdening him with building so that people should see, etc.? With Rashi's Arichos Haloshin V'Lamo Yitriche B'Binyan Zeh, Rashi is coming to explain that the question over here is not only why Hashem chose this way of saving Noach through a teva, because why couldn't Hashem save Noach some other way? Says the Rebbe, because in Derech HaPshat, that's not a very, very big question. The natural, normal way of saving from water is going to be through something like a teva, through some sort of ship. And this is why, in fact, Rashi doesn't bring what the Medrash says, couldn't Hashem save Noach some other sort of way, with his amunah, with his speech, to bring him up to heaven? That's not what's bothering Rashi, why it was a ship as opposed to another way. Mainly what's bothering Rashi, or Rashi is asking, is why is it so important that Noach himself should work so hard for so many years in building the teva? In other words, what's the purpose of the building itself, that becomes a mitzvah, and that this is why Noach himself has to do it? This is what Rashi is answering, because it was in order that people should see him doing. In other words, the bother with the building, this itself is in order to arouse people to do tshuva. And therefore it's understood why here the mitzvah is the actual building of the teva itself, not only the end result. Says the Rebbe, we still need to understand, Rashi in his Pirush HaTorah is always coming to explain Pshutei Shel Mikra. What is forcing Rashi in Derech HaPshat that when the Eibishter says Asei Lucha Tevas, Atze Goifer, etc., means that the Eibishter wants specifically that Noach should have this difficult work or burden, etc., Noach himself needs to go ahead and build a teva. Especially that it's very, very difficult to imagine how one person could build this teva of 300 cubits, the length, etc., etc., etc. Says the Rebbe, now you might want to say it's because of the expression we said before, Asei Lecha, that Hashem said, you should make it. Says the Rebbe, it's difficult to say this because this kind of expression and similar ones we find in a number of places, and in Pshutei Shel Mikra it doesn't necessarily have to mean that Lecha means you should do something. It could be Lecha, could mean Bishvilcha, it could mean, like in some other places, it means it should be done for you. It could be Mishalcha, it could mean that it belongs to you, it should be from your money, from your possessions, as in other places. So why does it have to be over here that it means Noach himself should make it? Says the Rebbe, what's forcing Rashi to say this is actually the order and the flow of the psukim. When Hashem says to Noach to make the teva, it says it immediately after saying how what's happening with the Doir HaMabel, how Hashem is saying how the end of all flesh has come in front of me, I'm going to destroy them, etc., etc. It doesn't say a word yet about the Mabul. In other words, it's before the pasuk that says I'm going to bring a Mabul of water, where it's going to say exactly what's going to happen. Suddenly, just after saying how upset Hashem is with the people and he's going to destroy them, he says to Noach, Hashem says to Noach, make a teva. From this, Rashi learns that the words Asei Lecha Tevas, the making of the teva, is not only for the end result, that ship that we're going to have at the end to save him from the water. The water wasn't even discussed yet. Rather, the point is, in other words, it's not for saving from the water, rather the act itself of building the teva. Hashem was upset with these people. He's telling Noach now to build a teva because this is an inyan in itself, an end in itself in a certain sense, as a warning for the people. The Rebbe says, we discussed many times already that the derech of Pirush Rashi al HaTorah is not necessarily always going to be exactly in accordance to his Pirush al Hashas. Even though in both cases he is explaining the Pashat, the Pshat in each one. Nevertheless, it's not going to be the same, the simple meaning of the Gemara, how we understand the Gemara, or when we learn things according to halacha, is not necessarily always going to be fitting with Pshutei Shel Mikra, the way Rashi learns according to the simple meaning of the psukim. These are two different styles of learning, and therefore one cannot ask a question, a contradiction between the way Rashi learns in Chumash and the way Rashi learns in Gemara and Shas. The Rebbe says this is specifically emphasized. We see this in our inyan over here as well. In Masechta Sukkah, Rashi says that Shem was actually building the teva along with Noach. The Ragachover wants to say, based on this Rashi, he says, from this we see that the mitzvah was the end result, the teva, not the actual building. Opposite of what we just said is the way Rashi learns in Torah, in Chumash, that it was Noach himself building it. Because as we just explained, that is the act of building, not only the end result. And the Rebbe says, why does Rashi and Chumash have to learn like this? Different to the way he understands it in the Gemara, because in Pshutei Shel Mikra, there's no hint in any way whatsoever that Shem was helping along. On the contrary, from the way the Pasuk says that Noach did everything the way Hashem commanded him, it's mashma, as Rashi learns in Pirush al HaTorah, that Noach himself was the one building the teva. Says the Rebbe, this will also fit very, very well with the flow of the psukim over here. From the fact that the Pasuk says first, Asei Lecha Tevas, to first make the teva. As we said before, this means that there's a mitzvah in just making the teva, even before discussing the mabul. And therefore we also find in Medrashei HaTorah that the involvement of building the teva, as we said before, was just for this purpose of being Mo'orer to tshuva. And as a result of that, we also said, what's the mitzvah? The actual building of the teva itself, not only the end result. Whereas in his Pirush on Shas, Rashi is going according to what seems to be the Shita of the Gemara and Halacha. That is, number one, in the Gemara it just says that Noach was warning the people, telling them to do tshuva. The Gemara does not, as in the Medrash, connected with the idea of the building of the teva. It speaks about him trying to be ma'ored the people to do tshuva, but it doesn't connect it with the building of the teva. Even in the continuation of the Gemara, where the people say to him, old man, what is this teva all about? And he tells them what the Eibishter said, etc. It sounds like their question was regarding the teva. What's the teva all about? But not his building of the teva. Again, there is the end result, but not his act of the teva. Number two, says the Rebbe, the Gemara doesn't even mention this whole idea that it took 120 years. Again, Rashi says this, the Medrash says this, but not the Gemara. And this is what tells Rashi that according to the Gemara, according to the Gemara Shitta, it's the building of the teva was only for the end result, for saving them from the water. And the idea of being ma'oreh the people to do tshuva, this is a separate idea, not connected with building the teva. In other words, the mitzvah is the end result, the teva itself, and therefore there's no obligation for Noach to build a teva. Anyone else can help him as well, like Shem, because it's only about having a ship, having a boat all the way at the end. This is one way, the way the Rebbe learns. The Rebbe says the truth of the matter is, we could also say that even in Shas, Rashi could hold that the mitzvah is the building of the teva, not necessarily only the end result. But, says the Rebbe, Rashi could hold, like some other poskim hold, that a ben Noach could be a shliach for another ben Noach. And therefore, Shem helping him build a teva would be considered as if Noach himself would have built a teva, because Shem is doing it as a shliach for Noach. But that could work in the Gemara. Whereas, again, b'pirushei ala Torah, Rashi is going according to Pshuti Shel Mikra, that if there's a command for someone to do something, and then he cannot do it through a shliach, the Rebbe says, this is explained more in other places, but the point is that Noach himself had to build a teva. The Rebbe says, we discussed many times that all the different pirushim in one pasuk are always connected to each other. Says the Rebbe, so too in our case. In regards to the idea of asay lecha, the Ragged Shavar says that lecha over here could also be understood, is also understood mishelcha, that Noach had to build a teva from his own possessions, from his own money. Says the Rebbe, we need to say that this pirush in asay lecha, of making it from his own possessions, is connected to the pirush that we were just speaking about, that Noach himself had to make the teva, because the actual building of the teva itself was the mitzvah. So the Rebbe says we're going to understand this by first explaining a similar idea, a similar expression that we have by the teva, we find in regards to the sukkah. First of all, the Rebbe says we know that the two ideas of the teva and the sukkah are connected to each other. Chassidus explains that the sukkah is similar to the teva of Noach. By both of them, both ideas was the inyan of shalom, of peace. By the teva of Noach, we know that all the different animals were able to be in the same teva together and in a situation, a state of peace, similar to the time when it's going to be when Mashiach comes, that lo yareyu v'lo yashchisu, they won't be harming each other. And so to sukkah is connected with peace, as we say, Ufrois aleinu sukkah shloimecha. Chazal say all Yidden could be sitting in one sukkah together. Again, an idea of peace. What do we find by the sukkah? We find a similar expression like by Noach, where by Noach it said asay lecha, the teva, chag sukkah, we say ta'aseh lecha, a similar expression. So we see that in these ideas that we said by the teva, number one, that the making of the teva itself is a mitzvah. Number two, we said that it has to be from your own money, from your own possessions. Number three, that we also said that in addition to all of that, there is the result at the end that's going, the teva is going to be saving Noach. The Rebbe says all of these things, we find something very similar by the sukkah. Number one, the actual making itself of the sukkah is a mitzvah. According to the Yerushalmi, you actually have to make a bracha, la'asos sukkah. Number two, the sukkah has to belong to you. Number three, the point of the sukkah is so the people should know that I put the Yidden in huts, in sukkahs, in the clouds, when I took them out of Mitzrayim. These were ananei hakavod, the clouds of glory that surrounded them, protected them as shade, so that the heat and the sun shouldn't be able to hurt them. And this is why we have sukkahs, which are made for protection. Again, just like the teva was made for protection and for saving. Nevertheless, as the Rebbe, we find a difference between the sukkah and the teva of Noach. By the teva, we said Noach himself had to build a teva, whereas by a sukkah, even though we say it's a mitzvah, but definitely someone else could build a sukkah for us. Number two, the teva, we said, has to be completely Noach's teva. It has to belong to him completely. It had to be from his possessions, from his money. Whereas by a sukkah, we know a person could be yoitza with the sukkah of his friend, a borrowed sukkah, and that will be considered harehi kishaloi, it's as if it is. How do we understand this? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by generally understanding the avodah of Noach in connection to the Mabul. By first prefacing, the Zohar says, the difference between Noach and other tzaddikim that were after him, that Noach was not davening for his generation, loy boer rachmin al alma. And therefore the Mei HaMabul are considered Mei Noach. In other words, as if his fault almost, it's dependent on him, he didn't daven for the world. Whereas the tzaddikim that came after him, they were moiser nefesh for their generations, as we find by Moshe Rabbeinu, that says to the Eibishter, v'im ayin, if you don't forgive the Yidden, mecheinin av mesifrecha asher kasafta, erase me from the Sefer Torah. Says the Rebbe, first of all, there's a simple question. Chazal tell us that Noach was rebuking the people and arousing them to do tshuva. So it seems like he definitely did care about the people of his generation. So how do we understand is that he wasn't davening and being ma'oder rachamim for them? Says the Rebbe, the pshat is like this. When Noach was rebuking them, it was mainly not because of his mesiras nefesh for his people. It was all part of him fulfilling what Hashem told him to do. And therefore, Chassidus tells us that Noach, he didn't really put himself completely out on this. In other words, that he should really try to impact them to be the ma'oder to tshuva. He didn't put his life on the line, so to speak. He didn't really put himself into it. Because his toichacha, his rebuke was mainly just to fulfill what Hashem said. In other words, he's doing his obligation. And therefore, he doesn't have the same mesiras nefesh to be davening and begging for the people. Whereas by Moshe Rabbeinu, that it really bothered him, the situation of the Yidden, to the extent that it was negayah to him as if it was for himself. He's being moiser nefesh for them. He's mispalel for them. He's being moider rachim to the extent that he says, "V'im ayin mecheinin ha-mesifrecha asher kasafta." Says the Rebbe, now we can understand the difference between the teva of Noach and Sukkos, which Moshe Rabbeinu receives, and Kibul Mesinai, Musara, etc. This idea of not asking rachamim for his generation expressed itself also in the way he builds the teva. The idea of being saved simply from the Mei HaBabul, the building of the teva, was in order to be able to bring into the teva only Noach and his family, not his generation. Says the Rebbe, for this reason, the building itself was also only by whom? Only by himself, and only from his own possessions. It's all about him. Whereas after Matan Torah, when Yidden are all one, a metzius of one congregation, of one community, we're all one, especially after they go into Eretz Yisrael and there's now a concept of arvus, we're all guarantors for each other. We are one everlasting, eternal metzius, where every Yid is noigeya, the metzius of another Yid. Especially by those mitzvahs where the inyan of Achta stands in a revealed way, like the idea of Sukkah, which we said before is the idea of Shalom. If that's the case, so then even when another Yid does the mitzvah, it can be considered as if I did it. And even the sukkah of another Yid can be considered as if it's my sukkah. We can be yotzei dechivasei because the Yidden are all mamish one, kiguf echad.